Salam, good evening, and welcome to the Brisbane premiere screening of Return to Gaza. This is a documentary directed and written by Michael Weatherhead and produced by Schonell. My name is Sarah Giles and I will be your MC for this evening. I am an activist with the Justice for Palestine organisation, and that is a Brisbane-based campaign group for the rights of the Palestinian people. Tonight, Justice for Palestine is very pleased to present this screening of a documentary which has been nominated for 6 awards and has won an Indie Award of Excellence and an accolade in the USA. Tonight, we are also privileged to have the writer and director of this documentary, Michael Weatherhead, joining us, as well as the producer, Schonell. In a minute, I will ask Michael to introduce the film, but first I'd like to make you aware that at the close of the screening this evening, that we're going to be having a question and answer session with Michael, and that in that session that Michael will also be joined for the Q&A session by Australian-Palestinian writer Samah Sabawi. And Samah is the co-author of the book Journey to Peace in Palestine, and is also a former executive director of the National Council of Canada-Arab Relations. So now please welcome Michael to introduce the film.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to give a very brief introduction because I think the film speaks for itself, and it's much easier to talk about it afterwards when people have got questions and they can bounce off what they've seen in the film. But I'll give a brief introduction on how this came about. I was actually filming a music festival on the Gold Coast and got a call from another filmmaker in Melbourne who'd met Sabawi. In fact, he'd made some music videos with him. He's quite an accomplished musician. And my friend said to me, look, my thing's drama, and Fatah wants to make a documentary in the Middle East. You know, would you be interested? And I said, oh, I guess so. And I flew down from the Gold Coast to Melbourne a couple of days later. The following day I had a meeting with Fatah, and the next day we were filming. And there wasn't time to raise funds, there wasn't time really to do very much at all because Fatah jumped on a plane for the Middle East a week later. So we started making this on the run, and like a lot of documentaries, you sort of cross your fingers and go, well, I hope there's a good story here. I'm a little biased, but I think there is a good story, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
I'm very proud of my baby brother, and I was the voice of doom and gloom in the movie, saying that you cannot have an election under occupation, you cannot practice a democracy under occupation. Just a few things that I wanted to highlight about the film. My brother went in there trying to see what it would take to find peace, and I think he discovered that peace is not the cessation of violence, but the presence of justice. And it was the lack of presence of justice in the Palestinian territories and the way that the Israelis were treating the Palestinians that have really defined this film in a way that I found was very powerful. My brother was not a very political man when he went, and you could just see the anger building up when he went from Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he was confronted with the apartheid wall. And from there on, you see the landscape changing. I mean, you look at Tel Aviv and its beautiful restaurants and nightlife, and then he goes to Jerusalem and things change a little bit. Then you go into the West Bank and they change a little bit more. And then by the time you make it through the long tunnel into the imprisoned and impoverished and besieged Gaza, you really are confronted with the worst that this occupation has had to offer. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I wanted to highlight the fact that really this experience of, or experiment of trying to create all the apparatus of a state and the illusions of a state, the ministries of a state, the elections, the whole process, without actually having justice being served first and equality, it doesn't work, and it's not going to work. I think I'm ready for questions now. Yeah, we're ready for questions.
I might just make a comment. As a filmmaker, it was an interesting challenge. I was constantly grappling with where the story was, and we ended up with, I think we got back from the Middle East with 40 hours of footage. And, you know, sorting through that was hard work. There were highlights, you know, some of the more grim spots. Sometimes as a filmmaker in a war zone, you feel a bit like a panel beater or a tow truck driver. You're hoping for some drama, but it's not the sort of drama you really want people to have. And there were things that we weren't allowed to shoot, some of which we did anyway. The border crossing, the areas checkpoint going to Gaza, we were told a number of times to switch the camera off, and we pretended we did. And that was quite a powerful piece, and it was, you know, I'm really glad we persisted. I also set out wanting to tell both sides of the story, and Fatah and I clashed a little bit over that because it was hard. And in the end, I realised I was following a personal journey, and I had to do justice to that. And it was Fatah's personal journey which defined the film, and everything else fitted in around that was secondary. I still wanted to make an objective documentary. I didn't set out to make something that was pro-Palestinian, although I've always been a sympathiser. And I wanted to make something that was sophisticated enough that a broader audience could appreciate, and hopefully I've done that. But I'm the director and I'm very close to it, and I can't say really whether that's true or not. Anyway, let's throw it open to questions.
Well, I have a question. The world was not ready for a green victory in January 2006. Certainly the US wasn't ready. Even here in Australia, John Howard wasn't ready. And I'm wondering if you have a view, either of you have a view of what the future may have been like had the US decided to endorse that democratic result and use that as leverage to force the Israelis back to the table and to recognise Hamas, which had reborn itself as a political organisation. So I'm just wondering, what do you think if the US and you know the West generally had chosen to endorse that result? What kind of a different future would it have created?
I think we've talked about that extensively internally as Palestinians and within the pro-Palestinian camp. What we had in 2006 were a forced election. I'm going to take you back for the year leading up to 2006, in which Mahmoud Abbas was president, and the Israelis were refusing to actually engage with Mahmoud Abbas on any talks, any meaningful talks. So in the lead up to the election, Mahmoud Abbas was a very weakened man, and the writings were sort of on the wall if you wanted to look. And yet the international community really forced this election, and in which the Fatah and Hamas faction participated. Now the funny thing about this is, with the international observers who went to observe this election and make sure that it's flawless, came back and said, you really didn't have to teach the Palestinians anything about democracy. It was unbelievable. I mean, you know, it was a very fantastic campaign, and they were excited, and they were democratic. So we had no issue with the democratic process, but we had an issue when it came to who won the election. And suddenly the US and the rest of the world were changing their tone, and they weren't so interested in democracy. So to answer your question, I think by entering into the elections, Hamas was showing that it was open to moderation. And I think the international community missed an opportunity to actually make this work. But then again you have to assume that they had the intention of making it work, which I don't think they did. I think at any point in the history leading up to where we are today, the international community had ample opportunity to pressure Israel by so many means. I mean, just sticking to the international laws that exist that Israel is in violation of. They had a lot of means to pressure Israel, and they haven't. So we really have to question whether the international community at any point was really serious about implementing a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
I'll add a little bit to that. I think to force an election on people and not anticipate an outcome that one of the parties was going to win was ridiculous. I can't imagine that the Americans hadn't anticipated that. Just isn't in my capacity. I mean, you know, the State Department's got a lot of people. Someone must have thought it. Hamas could have won. So it's left a huge question mark in my mind. You know, what were they thinking? You know, it doesn't actually add up to me. And I think it would have saved a lot of pain if they accepted the outcome. Hamas didn't want to go into government. They wanted to form a coalition. They didn't feel like they had enough experience. There was a whole lot of options there. And, you know, the West, I think, chose a disastrous route to go down. And it's very sad. You know, there was still hope when we left the Middle East, but it faded and it ended up in a disaster.
On the hope thing, I mean, it was all terrible and gloomy, and toward the end of the movie, one of the, I don't remember her name, one of the experts that was talking, she said that... yes, yeah. Her. She was talking about how the Palestinians have never been this hopeless, and that, you know, they were not so hopeless and now they're so hopeless. And I just want to say that we're not hopeless, that I see a lot of hope, and I see a lot of opportunities ahead, and I think that there is a new movement of Palestinians who are looking beyond the whole PA Oslo agreement box that we've been boxed in for so long. And we're looking beyond that. We're adopting a different language. We're choosing the narrative that we want to use. We're choosing the words that make sense to us, like the word apartheid, and like the word boycott, and like the word international law, and like the words we are entitled to these rights. And I think with this new movement that is rising, there is a lot of hope out there. I don't think we're hopeless. Just wanted to put that on record.
Yeah, just on that question of hope, I wanted to ask about the impact of the democratic revolutions in the Arab world, especially Egypt, and what impact that's had on the Palestinian population. First point, has there been any easing of the blockade on the Egypt-Gaza border? And secondly, what is the feeling of the Palestinian masses about that, about what's happened in the rest of the Arab world?
The entire Arab world, as the entire rest of the world, was watching what was happening in Egypt in Tahrir Square, and we're all owning that moment where we see an oppressed people liberate themselves. It was very special for the people of Gaza, and one of the most profound and amazing clips that I saw that just had me almost in tears were little Palestinian kids in a protest, not protest, they were actually celebrating Mubarak's resignation, and they were saying freedom, freedom, hurriya, hurriya. That's all they were saying. So they could actually smell the air of freedom, which was just very powerful to see. There hasn't really yet been an easing of the blockade. The position by the current establishment is that until there is a new elected government, there is really nothing can be done to change existing structures and existing laws. So we're hopeful. We'll see what's going to happen 6 months from now with the new government in Egypt. But you know, the entire region is changing, so there is really no telling where things are going to go next. But the most important thing for us to think about is that nobody thought that it would be possible that we would have these tyrants and dictators literally just disappear and have this amazing movement on the ground. Again, another reason for Palestinians to be very hopeful.
I might just add to that, going back to Catherine Hughes-Freytek, who was talking about them being hopeless. She, in her defence, she's been there every year for 20 years. And I agree with Samah too, they're not hopeless. There's still a lot of hope. I'm still very hopeful. However, I remember having a conversation with Fatah at one stage, and he was talking about what things were like under the trade blockade, and he said, everyone's depressed. I think, you know, they've been ground down more and more year by year. And they get their hopes up too, you know. Fatah's father, who's up the back here tonight, and in fact a lot of the family. So, you know, to go to Gaza after the Oslo Peace Accords and build a hotel, I mean, that's a huge sign of hope. And every time, you know, there's a breakthrough, Palestinians go back there, wanting to rebuild, and then it's dashed. And I think they'll keep going back. Hopefully, it'll amount to a lot more at some stage. So, hope and hopelessness.
Since you mentioned my father, I just, he is joining us here, and he was the star at the end of the film. Many of you saw him. Thank you. I always end up talking about him when I do public speaking at events, because he's had such an impact on us in so many ways. The scene where he is in Rafah, to me, I just want to explain that to you a little bit more. My father has lived his entire life exiled from his home, uprooted, literally uprooted, and never actually has been able to set roots again. So he's been like this floating creature, just waiting for the time where he can go and reconnect, where he belongs, where he makes meaning, where he has meaning, and where he has felt that he was unjustly removed. So when Oslo didn't go through, after he built his beautiful resort in Gaza and put all his life savings in it, and Oslo did not go through, and we had the third Intifada breakout, he was no longer allowed back in Gaza. And so what to do, he actually set up camp on this piece of land that was right on the fence in Rafah, Egypt, which is very close to Gaza, where he would say he could smell the air of Gaza and see the sea of Gaza. So his connection to the land, for us, me and my brother, and really for the entire generation of Palestinians who were born and raised in diaspora, to have parents who are just so connected, and to see the pain in their eyes for feeling that they just don't make sense, that their lives has been derailed and taken in a different direction. I just want to pay tribute to this great man who's sitting in the back and say, I love you.
You mentioned during the Egyptian Revolution how children in Palestine had started chanting freedom. That was an aspect in the film that really interested me as well, that this young 12-year-old boy was explaining why Hamas would win the elections. I'm wondering what both of you would say about the impact and the nature of oppression on young children. I mean, because it ties into issues of how young Palestinian boys are throwing stones at tanks, how mental health issues are very much interlinked. So what is the nature of oppression, and what is its impact in Gaza?
I'll start. Look, I'm sure it's considerable. One of the strange things that I found in Gaza, it was midwinter. It was freezing. It was like as cold as Melbourne ever gets. I'm originally from Melbourne, but I left there because it was too cold for me. And every window would be left open an inch, and I would shut them. And people, don't shut them. If the Israelis fly over below in a jet with a sonic boom, they'll shatter the windows. You've got to leave them open. There's constant harassment. You know, there's people traumatised just from, you know, the jets with the sonic boom. Not to mention all the other violence, invasions, and so on. It's terrible. And I think that boy, who everybody has said, he's incredibly aware. For a 12-year-old boy he was, but I'm sure he goes home and the dinner conversation is what's going on in the politics of the world. They don't have computer games, they have family and conversations, and they're very aware of what's going on. But decades of oppression is catastrophic. There's people who've been in refugee camps for 60 years. That is disastrous. I mean, if that's not a hotbed for breeding terrorism, I don't know what is. I got the impression that the Palestinians are actually very gentle, patient people, perhaps too much so. Anyway, I think oppression is a very damaging thing.
Absolutely, it's very damaging, and it's felt more in different areas. I mean, I hate to put a percentage on suffering, but I think in Gaza today is where we have something that is just inhuman to actually even be able to watch and to know and not to do something about. The Gaza population is 1.5 million. Almost 2/3 of the population in Gaza are children. So just that fact alone, 75% of the population in Gaza are refugees. So they are people who have actually been pushed out of their homes inside what is now known as Israel proper. And they've been in these camps in Gaza for over 60 years. So you've got a predominantly young population, a high percentage of malnutrition and stunted growth according to UNRWA statistics in children born in Gaza. According to a statistic by UNICEF, a high percentage of children in Gaza suffer trauma and all the signs of trauma, including bedwetting. They exhibit hysterical behavior, and they're unable to focus and so on. And that's because of there used to be the sonic booms, and recently it's been drones on a daily basis, missiles. And when you think of Gaza, it's 15 kilometers wide and 45 kilometers long. It's a very tiny strip of land, and it's one of the most highly densely populated areas in this world. And so when you have missiles falling, it is felt almost across the board. There is no safe place to play. There is no safe place to hide. And when we have the bombs falling from the sky, there is nowhere to run to. They're not allowed to leave. They're imprisoned. They cannot run from the bombs. So to just think of what kind of generation is growing up under this kind of inhumane pressure is enough for us to really want to move on and do something to pressure Israel to respect international law and the humanitarian law and the universal declarations of rights, especially the rights of children.
I'm going to go back slightly to the issue of hope. I was quite intrigued by Anthony Lowenstein, the author and journalist that we interviewed for this. We interviewed him, even though it might have appeared, we interviewed him in Jerusalem. We actually interviewed him in Sydney. But he, when he wrote his book, My Israel Question, caused a huge stir in the Israeli community. And he had distant relations say, I disown you, you're a self-hater, you're anti-Semitic, you don't belong in my family. But he got liberal Jews come to him and say, this is great, for the first time you've got a dialogue going about something that we feel bad about, and we have to talk about it. And there's more and more Jews coming out, like Anthony Lowenstein, taking issue on these things. And they've been there, or he has, and a number of others who really care have been there. They've been to the West Bank, they've been to Gaza, and they know what's going on, and they read about it. And Anthony Lowenstein said, when he went to Israel, that it was an insult for what was being done in his name. And I think that's an area of hope. And there's a new lobby group in Washington that's starting to challenge the traditional Jewish lobby. And it might take a long time, but I think the tide is slowly turning, and hopefully it speeds up.
We have another question.
I'd just like to ask a question and a comment on the documentary as a film rather than its politics. So the first is the main character, Feta, who I'd like to know a bit more about him. And the reason is that, as you know, there are lots of documentaries on Palestine, particularly that trip between the border and into Gaza. But I thought what was really particularly powerful about this documentary was the main character and how you traced his story. And he almost comes across as a naive, laid-back Aussie. I mean, who really would go to Palestine thinking, it's like asking where in the world is Osama bin Laden? I mean, where in the world is peace? So can you tell me what motivated him to go there? How Aussie is he? And it's a coming-of-age story. I mean, is that genuine? Does that make sense? That's a question. It's a lovely film. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I as a filmmaker, was drawn to him because he, is a regular Aussie at one level, and yet he's fluent in Arabic as well, and I felt he could transport a Western audience into the Middle East and give them an experience that's deeper than you might with something that was all in subtitles, or something that was done by a journalist who, doesn't speak Arabic or doesn't have the cultural background. He's a musician. He hasn't been to university, but he cares deeply about his people. In that context, he's quite a legitimate subject. He hasn't studied it in depth like Samah has, but he does know a lot about it. That was an issue while we were making the film, as to sort of how we represented him, and this, out of 40 hours of footage, probably more now, we had a few options and choices, and how we construed the story was a constant challenge. I think, personally, I feel like we've done justice to his story. We could have shown a bit more of his anger, and we cut some of his humour out because it didn't quite work. But some of it, like if we sort of had a section of bloopers or, sort of extra bits, some of it, would have been fun, because he wouldn't have, he wouldn't have been bothered by it. It was made on a shoestring. I pretty well funded it, and I'm trying to get sales at the moment. So we had our limitations, and he shifted ground through the process. But I think if I was in his shoes, I would have thought, well, we're finally having elections. We're going to have nationhood. To what degree that's hope, and to what degree that's naivety, it's a part of the human condition to have hope and, not to know everything.
It is a coming-of-age story. Feta has always been more interested in music. He is very much an Aussie in every aspect of his life. And we left separately. I was in Canada for 20 years, thus the accent. And when he decided he was going to go with Michael, he really wanted to go and to help with the refugee kids and to have a music program and to return. He had been there before. He loved the place. But he wasn't very, very political. He was political by virtue of being Palestinian. That doesn't mean that he's going to know everything that's going on. And I remember having a conversation with him about occupation. At the very beginning of the film, he says it's no longer, Gaza is no longer under occupation. This is assuming that Hamas has pulled out, so it's no longer under occupation. And actually made a note of mentioning that. What happens is he goes, and when he's first of all trying to get a permit from Israel, how do you not occupy a place and yet still control who gets in and out of that place? So I think there was a lot of reality checks that he experienced going through. Another thing we disagreed on was the elections, and you see me, blabbering on the phone to him about this. But he wanted to be hopeful. He wanted to believe. And you know what? A lot of Palestinians wanted and still want to believe that the peace process is going to yield something fruitful. And they still want to believe that there will be an end. So it's not naivety as much as just not being as cynic as some of us might be.
Thank you.
I would add to that, if you tackled most Australians, they don't really want to believe that white Australians are British Aborigines. I think every country has things that they want to believe or they want to hope. It's natural.
Going back to the election and recognising the importance of what Samah said about being able to choose language, just wondering, one of the slides with text that came up said, and sorry to interrupt, congratulations, because I also think it's an excellent film, a very compelling journey, and I especially like the interviews with the Jews in Tel Aviv. I thought that was very subtly done, and congratulations on that in particular. But I was just curious as to the description of the victory of Hamas, which said that Hamas seized control in the Gaza Strip, which is actually the language used at the time by the oppressors, and it seemed to be a curious use of that word, because after all, they did win the election democratically. It seems strange to describe that as seizing power.
I'll say a little bit. I think Samah can probably clarify that a little. I mean, there are words that we worked with and we grappled over how to put a really succinct sentence together that captured it, that wasn't misleading. There was a few other pieces that we really grappled with a lot. And, there were things that probably deserved a few pages, but to have 3 lines on a screen, it's a hard call to sort of reduce, something very complex down to a few words. I think that's a moot point. They did win. There's no doubt about that. But the powers that be didn't want to let go. So there was a kind of struggle from my perspective. But I think Samah might be able to provide a more accurate perspective.
I'll try, but my help in the back you can wave if I'm on the wrong track. My understanding was the movie showed that they won the elections, and then the seized, and I've seen this word used, was a result of the internal fighting that took place after a unity government was formed, which had a very short lifespan, that had both Hamas and Fatah in it. And I think people use the word seized, wouldn't be my choice, but it's used to say that after the internal fighting, the ones that seized the control of the strip were the Hamas. I don't know if that was what this was meant to be.
Thank you.
No waving from the back, so I think I've answered correctly.
There seems to be determined vested interest to divide Muslim and Christians in the world for some time now. And I'm wondering what's Hamas's views on Christians in Palestine, and how is that sort of accommodated in the whole sort of scheme of things?
There is no, I am not aware of any friction that exists between Hamas and the Christians in Gaza or in the West Bank. I think that the Palestinians have been quite united on the religious front. Palestinian Christians and Muslims feel that they're both in the same boat and that they're both fighting oppression and occupation. So as far as I'm aware, there's no friction.
Okay.
We have time for perhaps another question if someone would like to ask.
Can I just make a comment about the roles of different people? I was in Palestine last November, and what I noticed was, of course, all the deep divisions and multiple divisions between people from having lived in this conflict situation for so long. But it's almost as though people get frozen into these mindsets where they can't actually shift very far. And one example I'm thinking of was a demonstration just outside of Jerusalem, in a Palestinian village, where everyone from the village had moved up to the boundary of the settlement, and the Palestinian leaders were confronted by the Israeli soldiers, and the leaders said, "Put down your guns and join us. We want peace." And the soldiers were kids, but they looked like, "We don't know how to handle this. We've been trained to throw tear gas and escalate from there if we need to." But it's like, it was a really sort of critical moment where they thought, "We don't know what to do." And as we walked away, I spoke to one of the journalists who was from Al Jazeera, and I said, "Will you cover this?" And he said, "No." He said, "We haven't had any drama." And I said, "But you've had something really important where they're actually saying, let's share in peace." But it's like the media themselves are sort of frozen into this need for a dramatic thing. But he said there's nothing newsworthy, I think he said.
I think that may have very well been a possibility, that the media does chase the violence and the drama and the stories, for sure. But I think there's also a danger sometimes of focusing on something like that when it is the exception to the rule, because it makes it look like it may not be the exception to the rule. And we know that nonviolent protests in the West Bank, and especially in the areas of Bilin, in the area of Hebron, where ethnic cleansing has been going on at very rapid rates, recently in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, that they are firing tanks, what are they called, not tanks, tear gas canisters. And the protesters are met with violence, arbitrary arrests. A lot of the leaders of the nonviolent protests have been imprisoned in arbitrary arrests and so on. So I think, yes, the media is guilty of chasing drama, but at the same time, I wouldn't want them to also broadcast exceptions to the rule when we have a hard time broadcasting what is actually going on and what is actually prevalent when we look at the conflict. So I'm kind of two minds about it. I probably need to know more about that particular incident.
Just speaking about the media generally, Anthony Lowenstein pointed out to me that there were only 2 full-time professional journalists reporting from the occupied territories, and one of them got abducted. So it's down to 1. I think that the coverage of the Middle East is lopsided. I think the media has tended to stereotype certain issues, and the Middle East is one of them. And there's an African writer who gave a keynote address at the Sydney Writers' Festival a few years ago, Kimamanda Adichie, and she sort of particularly played on how Africa gets stereotyped. And she said, we've got to avoid the single story. There's multiple stories going on out there. And she said, she actually concluded, she spent the whole lecture talking about Africa, but concluded by saying, if we allow the media to pursue the Middle East the way it is, it's down to one story, a single story, and it's not the whole story. And she said that's one of the reasons we're failing in the Middle East. And I think the media sells news, and unfortunately that means looking for the drama. But I'm hoping that the internet gradually is breaking down the traditional media and providing the multiple stories that we need to hear.
I'm just going to add a little note on the media and its biases. Last week we had an election in Merrickville, and I don't want to go on talking about that, but BDS became a concern for that riding, and there was a lot of stuff in the paper about how terrible BDS is. A lot of misinformation was flying around about the Merrickville Council and the resolution. And when we tried to submit an article, I was told that they have plenty covered the Palestinian side. I asked them to point me to one article written by a Palestinian voice. I'm still waiting for them to send it to me, but I was aware that our voice was being shut completely out of that particular issue, which was too bad. So we wrote an article, and it was down to the drum. It looked like they were going to publish, and they pulled it out at 3 o'clock. I mean, they kept us all day saying they were going to publish. 3 o'clock, they said, no, we don't think we can do it. So we put it up on the internet, and it became by the next day the top 10 Twitter feeds in the world. The media is going to need to catch up to the fact that we have internet now, and that we do have a way to practice our freedom of expression.
So I think that's all the time that we have for questions this evening, but I just wanted to see if there was anything else that either of you wanted to say in conclusion, either about the film or about the situation for the Palestinians, just before we wrap up. If there was anything else?
I just want to thank Chantel and thank Michael. I'm sorry, I've gone blank. For giving voice to the often voiceless. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Sabawi family for their input, and I'd like to thank you all for coming.
So please join me in thanking Michael and Samah and Chantal as well. So just before you all leave, this screening has been a part of the Israel Apartheid Week activities that Justice for Palestine Brisbane has organised. You're all very welcome to attend the next Justice for Palestine event, which is a teach-in workshop this coming Saturday from 1 to 5 p.m. at QUT at the Kelvin Grove campus, and Samah will be coming along as well, and she'll be speaking at a session, as will Aboriginal elder Bob Anderson and musician and activist Phil Mansour. And so there are flyers for that event on your seats, which hopefully you will have got when you come in, but please look at them. Also, if you would like to be involved with the work of Justice for Palestine in Brisbane, please put your name on the contact list, which is at the table in the foyer just as you go out the door. So thank you all for coming and supporting this event tonight. Thank you to our special guests for coming, and good night, and wish you all a safe journey home.